I am Penelope, author of epic fantasy and paranormal romance, and welcome to my imaginary friends, a look behind the scenes of an author mapping the worlds in my head and making them a reality. Hello friends! Today is Saturday, February 13th, 2021, and this is episode 107 of My Imaginary Friends. I'm Leslie. This episode is sponsored by The Duke Heist by Erica Ridley, The Secret Identities, Forbidden Love, Opposites Attract historical romance by the New York Times bestselling author. Heists are very relevant to my needs right now, and Robin Hood-style heists with bad guys doing good things for those who can't help themselves are a special kind of catnip for me. This one has everything: dukes, carriages, 6 orphans adopted by a wealthy baron with a secret mission to fight for justice. According to Eloisa James, this is irresistible romance and a family of delightful scoundrels. So, if this sounds like something you need in your life, grab your copy of The Duke Heist by Erica Ridley at your favorite store, or visit ericaridley.com for more information. There's a special bonus for a limited time. If you buy The Duke Heist and register your purchase at Erica's website, she will send you a free bonus Winchester novella. There's also a free prequel called The Governor's Gambit that's available wherever books are sold. Visit ericaridley.com, that's ERICARIDLEY, and stay tuned to the end of this episode for a clip from the audiobook. So this week's best thing has got to be The Cat-Faced Lawyer. Now, if you're listening to this in real time, chances are good that you have seen The Cat-Faced Lawyer. But if you're in the future and don't recall or missed out on The Cat-Faced Lawyer, I will put a clip in the show notes. Essentially, since everything is on Zoom now, in court, including court cases, there was a situation with a court case, I think it was in Texas, and where one of the lawyers had, was using a computer that a child had used previously and had a cat filter on it, and came up to and showed up to court with a cat face and could not figure out how to turn it off. And the judge was very calm and very kind and didn't laugh. And everyone managed somehow not to laugh at this poor man. And the classic line from this is, "I am not a cat." It brought me so much joy. It was so pure and just an encapsulation of this moment that we are in, where everything is online and you're constantly either muted or your video doesn't work or there's a cat filter. I didn't know Zoom had cat filters. I've been looking for them. I can't find them. I want one, honestly. But actually the judge himself tweeted out that video because these court cases are public record. I think they stream live or something on Facebook or on YouTube. And, he made it clear that he wasn't doing it so we could laugh at this poor man, but just to say justice marches on in the face of the pandemic. And eventually, the lawyer figured out how to turn off the filter and the case went forward. But it was a bit of lightness and joy and hilarity that I think everyone needed. I couldn't stop laughing. I watched it over and over again, laughing hysterically. And it was a cleansing type of humor that wasn't really at anyone's expense because, I'm fairly tech savvy and I'm having trouble with all of these online meetings, making sure everything is working properly. So I have a lot of empathy for those who are not tech savvy and having to deal with this. Cat-Faced Lawyer brought joy to all of our hearts this week. I don't usually do this week's worst thing, but I will make an exception. Since we were talking about heists and Robin Hood-style heists, I watched the 2017 version of The Saint, the movie, and it was spectacularly bad. I honestly have a very high tolerance for bad movies, especially action movies where I'm not expecting a whole lot. I just want to be entertained. I want to see some crime solved, some people fighting, some things blowing up sometimes. But the level of nonsensicality, if that is a word, evident in this script was truly epic. It has Eliza Dushku and a British guy that I don't actually know. So Roger Moore was in it in a cameo. And it was cool because apparently they had 2 former saints, that the saint has been in lots of movies and TV shows, that character. And apparently Roger Moore was trying to do this as a pilot he was the producer of this, to bring this as a pilot for a TV show and didn't get picked up. And then they eventually released it as a movie. And it has a lot of style, not a lot of substance. And the script just made me scratch my head many, many times. So I cannot recommend it, but there's a lot of bad movies that I watch that don't really bother me. My husband will be like, "Oh, that was terrible." I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine." But every once in a while, I'll come across something that is so bad that even I can't handle it. Like, I was like, should I turn this off? I don't feel like moving. I had just watched Cinderella with Brandy and Whitney Houston, which just came to Disney Plus. And after that, and I had never seen it before. It was 1997 when that movie came out, and I was a sophomore in college. So somehow it missed me. I know it was a very big part of a lot of people's lives, but I had never ever seen it. So I watched that, and I'm a sucker for Cinderella. I love Cinderella. I really liked Whitney Houston. I can't say that I super enjoyed that movie, but I appreciate it. I was mildly entertained. And so afterwards I was looking for something else to watch that was, maybe kind of silly, kind of actiony. And I picked The Saint because it was in my list on Netflix. And I don't know when I put it in my list, but it didn't work out so well. Writing update. I am at 51,785 words in the manuscript. That doesn't sound quite right. I didn't record Fridays, but let's use that number because that's what I have. I am moving right along. I realized, looking back at my schedule of writing, and that's why the tracking in my spreadsheet is really helpful, that, every week I write 6 days a week. I take off generally Saturdays, unless the schedule needs me to take off a different day. And as it turns out, every fourth week I need 2 days off. I end up just calling an audible and either probably taking off that Sunday also, if I'm just feeling a little tired and a little bit frayed. And that's interesting because I noticed that pattern for the first time. So I like the tracking, and I like knowing that I probably need 6 days off per month of writing, especially when I'm in this revision stage and everything is really creatively taxing, more so than first drafts. I mean, first drafts I don't like at all, but I can just sort of vomit them out the way my college screenwriting professor, Hailey Grima, used to say, vomit out the draft. I can vomit out a first draft and not feel emotionally and creatively depleted afterwards, but revising some of the stuff is just taxing. So 6 days off a month, that will help me in future planning, having those kind of hard numbers. Like I know that I probably do 6 to 7, but 7 days off a month is a whole week. That sounds like a lot. And I guess it is, but if you know that that's what you need, then you can say, okay, I'm going to plan to write 21 days a month, and if I get more, that's great. Hopefully I won't get any less than that, because that's probably a clue that something big is wrong. I also got a bit stuck at the end of the week with a scene that's mostly exposition. So there is this is the 1920s fantasy heist story that I'm writing, and sometimes you just need people to get some information. Someone has to tell them some information. In this case, they're finding a document and they're reading this information. So I have to figure out, as the author, how do I communicate the information in this document to the reader? Now, I could write this fake document and print it in the book, and that seems like the most work that I don't have to do, because I have to write it in the style of the person who wrote it, and that is not appealing to me at all. I could have someone read pieces of it, so I could just give out information. I could have someone read like a summary of it, like they read it and then they tell someone else what they read. But those things didn't feel like they had any tension in them. Like there's a more creative way to get this information to the reader. And so I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about how to play around with voice and narration and who is telling this. I'm already playing around with that with other areas of the book. Can I bring that into this scene? I haven't figured it out. It's kind of what I'm currently working on. But delivering exposition, especially in a fantasy, and this is exposition about like a magical thing, like it's a magical artifact, and you have to know about it, and you have to know what it does, and that sets you up for the rest of the book. There's a certain point at what I think, you avoid it as much as possible. You show rather than tell whenever you can. But there are always times when you have to just tell. And the part of the craft is coming in play where you have to figure out how to tell it in still an entertaining way. I think Blake Snyder calls this the Pope in the pool, which is where you have, you're telling it in some kind of unusual circumstance or situation so that the reader is a little bit distracted by the fact that the Pope is swimming in the pool while he's telling you all of this exposition. So thinking about that, and also just the narrative voice and the narrative devices that are already in play in the book, and how can I use those to get this chunk of information out. And so that's kind of taking a little bit of brainstorming. I usually feel like I take care to deliver world building and backstory in small chunks throughout, so that you're not, no one wants to have that big info dump. But we're far enough in the book. We're 51,000 words into the book, and it's time to just know some stuff. So that's where I am this week. I have been a bit behind in my podcast listening the past month or two, honestly. I just haven't been listening to all of the ones that I usually have been, but I did catch up with the Lit Service podcast, which is one of the only craft podcasts that I listen to regularly. I think Lit Service and Writing Excuses are the two big writing craft ones. And so they're our group of authors, and they usually have a guest, and primarily they do YA, but I find the craft things you can take into any genre. So it's episode 5.03. It says author-agent relationships with Ben Grange. And so they have an agent on who is one of the main author hosts of the podcast. It's her agent. And they break down a recent publishing deal that she got. I thought it was really interesting. And so for those of you who are new writers who are interested in that kind of thing, it's a great episode to listen to see an example of how that kind of thing goes down. And at the end of each episode, they do a mini critique of a few pages of someone's submission. So that's also interesting for me to hear. That's one of the reasons why I listen to the podcast regularly, just to hear their perspectives on the critique. I never actually go and find the original work that they're talking about. I just listen to them talk about it. But they do post them up if you are interested in that. So that was kind of cool. This was a deal that it sounded like it took years and years, from the first concept of the book to her writing it. And she wrote this novel while she was under contract with some other things, which I think is why it was like on the back burner and took her a long time. And then her agent talked about how he kind of dropped the ball a little bit because he was dealing with his own depression and mental health issues, and she had to sort of remind him. And it just reminds you that agents are human beings, and they're people with their own problems, and they're going through this pandemic like everyone else. But this must have been pre-pandemic, I'm assuming, because I think the book is coming out now, so the deal would have had to have been done a year or more ago. But even outside of a pandemic, I mean, this is not the only reason why people have struggles. Our editors, our agents, everyone down the line, they're people, and they've got people situations, whether it's family, friends, just dealing with themselves like we all do. And it's like, I know my agent's a person, like I met her husband and her child, and I value her as a human being. But sometimes I do have to remember that she is a human and she's going through her own things. And I'm trying to think back, like, I don't think it's really in my nature to not treat people like humans, but even just in my mind. And my agent is so great because she's so communicative, and there's never a point in time where I have to remind her about something, but it very well could come up. And yeah, it's just an important reminder to have. Like, we know they're people, but it's like seeing your parents as people in a certain way. Like, when was the first time you realized your mom and dad were just people and they were just doing the best that they could, It's grounding and it's humbling, honestly. So I recommend that episode and that podcast in general. Also, something really cool was the most recent video from Lessons from a Screenplay, which is a YouTube channel that I watch pretty regularly. I think I'm on their Patreon also. They did an episode on the movie Soul, the new Pixar movie with Jamie Foxx, and it's about the jazz musician who dies, and then he's in not the afterlife, the before life, the great before. And Tina Fey is in it, and I had mentioned it, I watched it a few weeks ago, and I really did enjoy it. And they break down character want versus character need. And this is another great thing to check out that I recommend. It's called The Soul of Good Character Design. And they talk about, specifically in that film, what the main character wants, which is, I think even if you haven't seen it, it's from the trailers, he wants to be a famous jazz musician. He's been a musician all his life. He starts out as a music teacher in middle school, And that is his goal. And how that movie did a really good job because they gave him a want that is a positive thing, and it's respected in our culture and society to be a great artist. Like, yeah, we're cheering him on. We want him to have this thing. But at the same time, the movie goes on to show that that is not actually what he needs. Regardless of whether he gets it at the end or not, he has a hole in him that, the character arc of the film is there to fill, to show him the hole he has and allow him to fill it. And yeah, it makes the point that it's really even more rich and layered when the character want is something that everyone can get behind and that everyone thinks is a good thing and that you're rooting for. And then if you not just twist it and turn it, but go deeper and say, the thing the character wants is often not the thing that they need. I think it's pretty basic sort of character development. And sometimes it's selfish, and sometimes it's misguided, and sometimes it's because of their character wound and the lie that they tell themselves. But even when that want is, it's not because of a lie. It's not like a response to a trauma, which is often the way that character arcs go. You want something because of something bad that happened to you that made you feel like you were worthless unless you had this thing. Even that's not the case here. It's a laudable goal that we look at artists as having achieved this wonderful thing, and they're in touch with their creative selves and all of this wonderful, great woo-woo stuff. But even then, sometimes a need can be greater, and filling that need is actually the thing that will give us fulfillment, not achieving the lofty goal that only a few people ever achieve. Not many people get to be famous jazz musicians. Not many people are talented enough, and those that are talented enough often have other roadblocks, other obstacles in the way to success. So yeah, that was, it was a good lesson or a good, deep dive into character development as a writer, and also kind of showing a really interesting way that it's accomplished. So an event alert, if you are listening to this in real time, I will be doing a panel for VirtuousCon, which is this coming weekend, February 20th and 21st, 2021. And I will be appearing on a panel on Sunday, the 21st, with Tanana Reeve-Dew and Stephen Barnes and some other great authors. It's called Breaking Borders, Black Representation in Speculative Fiction, and it will be really great. VirtuousCon is an online convention, like an SSF kind of Comic-Con type thing, that is being put on by my very good friend, Cerise Rennie Murphy. And I was at the beta a few months ago. She's doing a different kind of online conference, and I'm super excited about it. Like, so excited. So even if you're listening to this in the future, check out virtuouscon.com because she's going to be doing these regularly. And she's using a different kind of software, so the panel discussion will be kind of like Zoom style, but there is the artist floor, like the artist alley, where there's vendors and they'll be selling their wares, and you can actually go into their little rooms, their virtual rooms, and talk to them. And it just makes you feel a little bit more connected because it's not just Discord, it's not just like a one-way Zoom. It's each vendor has their own booth, and they can have X number of people in the booth, and then you're there, you're on video, they're on video, and you're chatting with them like you would walking up to a booth at a con. And I'm so excited and happy for her. She's got some great guests. She's got DC Comics sponsoring, and it should be really cool. So in real time, go check it out, virtuouscon.com. Anytime, go to the website, sign up for the newsletter so that you will be aware of the next time they have an event. And I hope that I will see you this weekend, if possible. That same weekend, on Saturday, February 20th, I'm also doing a fantasy romance panel for Pharaoh Feb, and that is at the Cary Library. So I will have links to both of those in the show notes. So that is it for me for this week. My goals are to get another 7,000 words at least, another 3 chapters in the book. I'm deep into research on my second project, and by the end of the month, I want to be fleshing out the outline. So the end of the month has 2 weeks left in this month. February's going by so fast. I've got another research book to read, and then I'm just going to focus on the outline and the story and the plotting so that I can hit March strong with doing the fast draft while still finishing the revision of the fantasy heist. And so, yeah, the first 2 weeks of March are going to be a little bit busy while I'm working on 2 things at once. But I think I can do it. I'm going to cross my fingers. Put some good energy into the universe for me, please. And I hope that you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you next week. For episode show notes and to sign up for the Footnotes newsletter and get the show notes in your inbox, go to myimaginaryfriendsshow.com. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and watch the video episodes on YouTube. I would really appreciate a rating and review to help support the show. And My Imaginary Friends is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. For more fantastic podcasts, go to frolic.media/podcasts. And now here is the clip of The Duke Heist by Erica Ridley.
Chapter 1. March 1817. London, England. Miss Chloe Winchester burst through the door of her family's sprawling residence in semi-fashionable Islington, followed closely behind by her sister Thomasina. Chloe's pulse raced with excitement. His arrogance, the Duke of frosty disapproval, didn't have a chance. Unable to keep her exuberance to herself, she yelled out, "I have news about the painting!" In a more respectable household, a young lady might expect censure for being so vulgar as to shout, even within the confines of one's own home. Such a young lady might also be rebuked for donning trousers and strolling about Westminster under an assumed identity. Chloe was grateful every single day not to have such limitations. Her roguish brother Graham appeared at the top of the marble stairs, delight and disbelief writ across his handsome face. He was used to being the one with shocking news to share. "Don't stand about! Come up to the planning parlour at once. I'll ring for tea." Exchanging grins, Chloe and Tommy dashed up the marble stairs, their grey cotton trousers allowing them to take the steps 2 at a time. In seconds, they joined Graham in the planning parlour, the communal private sitting room the 6 siblings used for plotting their stratagems. Chloe and Tommy tossed their matching beaver hats onto the long walnut and burl table in the centre of the sound-dampened room. Tommy rubbed a hand over her short brown hair, causing it to spring up at all angles. Graham moved a pile of scandal sheets from the table to the map case to make room for refreshments. Tommy and Graham launched themselves into their favourite needlepoint armchairs between 2 large windows outfitted with heavy calico curtains of ruby and gold. Chloe was far too excited to sit. Instead, she paced the black slate floor, which still contained traces of chalk from the last planning session. She paused before the unlit fireplace and lifted her chin. For as long as she could remember, 2 paintings had always hung above the white marble mantel. One of them had been missing for the last 8 months. But it wouldn't remain missing for much longer. "The planning parlour feels doubly empty without our Puck," Graham said gruffly. "Not just the parlour," Tommy corrected. "Our entire house." "Our lives." No one said the words out loud, but they all knew it to be true. The house had belonged to Baron Vanderbean, but the beloved painting belonged to all of them. Bean had rescued his motley brood of orphans over the course of a single summer. 6 proud, frightened children between the ages of 8 and 11. Chloe, Tommy, Graham, Jacob, Marjorie and Elizabeth. Life had taught them to be mistrustful and careful. Coming together as a family had been the most pivotal moment in their lives. Chloe lifted her gaze to the portrait above the left side of the mantel. Bean's fatherly visage bore a grin that crinkled the edges of his bright blue eyes. It was not at all the thing to smile in one's portrait, which was probably why Bean had done so. Chloe was glad he did. His smile always made her feel loved. A maid entered the room and began arranging the tea. Chloe tugged her cravat free so as not to fill it with crumbs. Tommy wiggled with excitement. "I can't wait to hear your plan, Chloe. Once Puck comes home, It will feel like having a part of Bean back, like being whole again. Chloe's heart pounded in agreement. All 6 of the siblings would do anything in their power to bring Puck and family home, where it belonged. Before they'd found each other, most of the siblings had never had anyone they could rely on or possessions to call their own. They'd learned the hard way not to develop emotional attachments to people or things. Bean had offered permanence, a place to belong, a home. He told them they were the children he'd always wanted but never had. From the moment each had arrived on the doorstep, they'd felt loved and cherished in a way they had never known. The oil painting was their first purchase as a family, their first decision as a family. For most of them, it was the first time their voices mattered. The artist's uncommon skill wasn't why they'd chosen the unusual painting. It was the subject. A forest scene featuring Robin Goodfellow, the mischievous demon fairy, sometimes known in folk tales as Puck, and 6 fellow sprites of all sizes and hues dancing about a fire with absolute freedom and joy. It was the visual representation of what they'd found in each other. Happiness, unconditional love, the ability to be oneself and to be bigger than oneself, to be a team and a family. That was the most magical part of all. That painting was their soul on canvas. To the Winchesters, the painting was a family portrait, and their most cherished possession. It belonged to all of them. It was all of them. Once Puck comes home, we can get rid of that cherub. All 3 gazes swung to the fireplace. An angel-shaped vase stood on the mantel, right beneath the faded rectangle where Puck and family should have been. A blank spot that matched the empty space in their lives where Bean used to be. Chloe swallowed hard at the injustice. 19 years earlier, the prior, Duke of Faircliff, had sold them the painting to pay one of his many gaming debts. Then, 8 months ago, when he suddenly wanted it back, the family refused. Instead of honouring the original transaction, the Duke stole the painting and left an ugly vase behind in its stead, as though that could possibly make up for their loss. Neither they nor the old Duke anticipated a carriage accident interrupting his journey home, or that he'd succumb to his injuries. When Bean visited the heir to politely request the return of their painting, the newly crowned Duke of Faircliff refused to see him. Rebuff Baron Vanderbean. Chloe's blood boiled. But that was hardly the first of the new Duke's endless slights and rejections. He'd always been too lofty and self-important to notice anyone of lesser rank, no matter the justification. Later, when Bean caught smallpox, he refused to allow the children into his sick room lest he expose them to the disease. They threw themselves into retrieving the painting and cursed Faircliff when Bean slowly slipped away, without the safe return of their heirloom. Then or now, the Winchester family couldn't command a single second of the new Duke's time. She ground her teeth. According to the society papers, the Winchester children were nothing more than a dead baron's charity orphans, someone you might toss a coin to out of pity, but never deign to speak to on purpose. She didn't care what Faircliff thought of her. Chloe was glad to be a Winchester. She wouldn't trade a single moment for the boring, buttoned-up life of the beau monde. Chloe was used to being invisible. It was her greatest talent, and often the reason for the success of their clandestine missions. It had begun as a game. When the 6 siblings were children, Bean taught them to play 3 impossible things to give them skills and confidence. They gathered information, breached barriers, and performed feats of daring. Later, Their team became the specialists to turn to when the justice system failed those in need. The Winchesters snuck food and medicine into prisons, exposed workhouses and orphanages with draconian practices, tracked down libertines who despoiled for sport, rescued women and children from abusers, delivered aid and supplies to those who needed it most. Bean had taught them nothing was impossible. Everyone deserved their best life. Their missions gave them purpose and adventure. Chloe loved slipping about unseen, doing good works beneath people's noses. But being overlooked on purpose was one thing. Being dismissed out of cruelty was far worse. "We no longer have to beg," Chloe announced. "We can steal it back from Faircliff, just as his father did to us." Graham added another tea cake to his plate. "How will we infiltrate the Duke's terraced fortress? That townhouse is as tightly locked down as his loftiness himself. Do we even know where he's keeping the painting?" Chloe grinned at him. "We don't have to. I know where it's going to be." He set down his cake. "Where? How?" She leaned back. "I sometimes watch parliamentary proceedings from the peephole in the attic." "Sometimes?" Graham rolled his eyes. "When have you missed one? And what does your obsession with politics have to do with getting Puck back?"
"Well, if you would let me finish."
Chloe pilfered her brother's tea cake and took a bite from the corner, chewing with exaggerated slowness before swallowing. "As I was saying, today, Tommy disguised us as journalists, and we sneaked into the Strangers' Gallery, where we sat behind Mr. York." "Wait," Graham interrupted, his brown eyes gleaming. "Mr. York, the MP whose daughter is rumoured to have caught the Duke of Faircliff's eye?" "It's more than a rumour," Chloe said sourly. "We overheard Faircliff say he intends to give Puck and family to Mr. York's daughter Philippa as a courting gift." Graham's face purpled. "Give away our painting? That knave! It's not his to give!" "That's the bad news," Chloe agreed. She affected an innocent expression. "The good news is that my Jane Brown alias has an invitation to Miss York's weekly ladies' reading circle. I met her when I was on that mission at the dreadful school for girls. Philippa was visiting with a charity group and... You know what? It doesn't matter. The important part is I have access to the home where the painting will be. It's our chance." Her brother pinned her with his too perceptive gaze. "You accidentally bumped into the Duke of Faircliff's future intended and now have a standing invitation into her household? That's a bit of good fortune." Yes." Chloe became suddenly enthralled by her tea. "A very lucky, completely random coincidence." It was definitely not because she read the same gossip columns as her brother and wanted to see for herself what kind of woman attracted the Duke of Faircliff's attention. Chloe had passed by him any number of times, not that he noticed. He didn't even acknowledge her when she'd placed herself in his direct path to demand the return of her family portrait. Barely a syllable had escaped her lips before he strode right past her towards something or someone he actually cared about. Blackguard. "Now that we know when and where to act, we can play the game and get the painting." Chloe counted the impossible things on her fingers. "First, ingratiate myself with the reading circle. Achieved. Second, retrieve Puck and family once Faircliff delivers it. Third, replace it with a forgery so no one suspects a thing. It all happens on Thursday." Graham frowned. Why would Faircliff wish to interrupt a reading circle? "He doesn't know he's going to." Chloe smirked. "The Yorks are surprisingly crafty." "Even a stiff, scowling duke like Faircliff is a catch worth bragging about," Tommy explained. "Mrs. York will want witnesses." "We don't want witnesses," Graham pointed out. "Wouldn't it be safer to bump into Faircliff on the street and accidentally swap his rolled canvas for ours." "It would indeed," Chloe agreed, "if Faircliff happened to stroll through Grosvenor Square with a rolled-up canvas. But the painting is framed, and the Duke will arrive in a carriage where the York butler will be watching." Graham lifted his tea. "There aren't a lighter set of fingers in all of London, so I've no doubt you can nick the canvas, and we'll ask Marjorie to create the forgery." All 6 Winchester siblings were talented in their own ways. Marjorie was an extraordinary painter who could replicate any artwork to match the original. Chloe smiled. "Marjorie finished ages ago. I just needed an opportunity to exchange canvases, and some way to smuggle it out without anyone noticing." She swapped Graham's spoon with Tommy's fork as she thought. Coins and keys were easy objects to palm, but a rolled-up canvas was much too big. "Could you strap a tube to your leg?" Tommy asked. "Perhaps if I walked very carefully," Chloe mused, then shook her head. "I would have to lift up my skirts to strap on the tube, and being caught like that would be worse. What I need is—" "Kittens!" Their rugged elder brother Jacob strolled into the planning parlour with a lopsided basket in his strong arms. "Most ladies love kittens almost as much as a good book. If you were showing off a new pet—" Chloe tensed. Although hints of fur clung to Jacob's ripped and patched waistcoat, she'd learned to be wary. The last time her brother had entered a room with a basket, he was trying his hand at snake charming. If she hadn't been wearing her sturdiest boots— "Do you really have a kitten in there?" "Ferrets," he admitted, his dark brown eyes sparkling. "But I have the perfect solution out in the barn. Tiglet is the best of all the messenger kittens." "Messenger? Kittens?" she echoed faintly. "Like pigeons, but terrestrial," Jacob explained earnestly. "More fur, less filth, the perfect cover. He can find his way home from anywhere. He'll be a splendid distraction, because where there's chaos—" "There's opportunity," Tommy finished, eyes gleaming. Chloe held up a finger. "First rule of 3 impossible things. No plan without a contingency." Graham brightened. "May I suggest—" "Your acrobatic skills are awe-inspiring, brother, but unnecessary in this instance." Graham's shoulders caved. "When will it be my turn?" "Whilst I don't anticipate the need for trick riding on the back of a racing stallion," Chloe assured him, "a driver would not be amiss, just in case I must flee in too much haste to flag down a hackney." "No hack required." Graham straightened. "We can't risk one of our carriages being recognised, so I'll drive a substitute that cannot be traced to the family." Tommy cocked her head. "If there is a queue of carriages awaiting their literary-minded mistresses, how will Chloe know which coach is the right one? Mine will have red curtains and a conspicuously displayed glove for good measure." Graham's eyes lit up. "Better yet, I will not only be the first carriage you come to, I'll be in the coachman's perch. You shan't miss me." "No plan without a contingency." Jacob's curly black hair dipped as he peeked into the basket of ferrets. "What if the York staff insist you move the carriage?" Tommy clapped her hands. "Elizabeth will distract them." When Elizabeth threw her voice, no one could tell where it was coming from. Their sister could emulate an entire crowd of distractions. She was also handy with a sword stick. Either skill would do the trick. Graham turned to Chloe, his eyes serious. "If we get separated for any reason, go somewhere safe. I'll find you." She grinned back at him, exhilarated by the upcoming adventure. Huck was finally coming home. The reading circle will have a wonderful afternoon. Other than a wee interlude with Tiglet, the most memorable event will be Miss York charming the Duke of Haughtiness. Graham lifted a broadsheet. "Their alliance will be the talk of the scandal columns. No one will remember anything else, which is too bad, because I rather enjoy their wild conjecture about us. One of my favourite columns claims, 'Such a large, isolated house could contain dozens of them.'" Chloe wrinkled her nose. "Those gossips make us sound like bats." "I like bats." Jacob scratched beneath the chin of one of the ferrets. "Bats are fascinating. They have navels like humans and clean themselves like cats. I have 13 of them out in the barn." "Please keep them there," Tommy murmured. "Or give them to His Iciness," Chloe suggested. "Faircliff deserves as much." Graham moved the broadsheets in search of his spoon. "No doubt the Duke's interest in Philippa York is monetary. Although she has no title, she does possess the largest dowry on the marriage mart. I've been keeping a tally." "Poor Philippa." Tommy's mouth tightened. "She deserves better." Chloe agreed. Faircliff single-handedly lowered the temperature in every room he entered. The man was all sharp cheekbones and cutting remarks. That is, to everyone but her. She was invisible when right in front of him, even when she was trying to be seen. Graham made a face. "Can you imagine being wed to that block of ice?" Chloe pushed her teacup away. "I cannot fathom a worse fate." Chapter 2. Lawrence Gosling, 8th Duke of Faircliff, was on the verge of achieving what had once seemed impossible, replenishing the dukedom's empty coffers and restoring its tattered reputation. His father had lived a charmed life on credit he had been unable to repay, and now, with the failure of their country estate's crops, the situation was becoming dire. If Lawrence did not secure a bride with a significant dowry before the end of the season, he would have to send the last of his loyal servants to the streets. He would not repay them so shabbily. Lawrence leaned forward in his rented coach and opened the curtain to be able to address his driver. As with all of his father's grievous missteps, each of Lawrence's attempts to restore respect and prosperity had been won at great personal cost. The sacrifice was worth it. Lawrence's reputation was spotless, his performance in Parliament impeccable. This season, marriage-minded mammas would have him at the top of their lists. For as long as Lawrence lived, the Gosling name and Faircliff title would never again be spoken with derision. No heir of his would be dismissed, forced to shoulder ridicule and isolation. Of course, that was because no one realised his shiny reputation hid a very empty pocketbook. The dukedom didn't need a dowry. The dukedom needed the dowry to end all dowries, a sum so staggering Lawrence could restore the half-abandoned, entailed country estate, repay the last of his father's debts, and have a respectable chunk left over to invest in a stable future. The dukedom needed Miss Philippa York. "The terrace house at the corner," Lawrence instructed the driver. "The one with yellow rose bushes." "As you please, your grace." Using a coach to travel from one end of Grosvenor Square to the other was a shameless display of pretension and excess, and the reason Miss York's parents looked favourably on a courtship between Lawrence and their daughter. Although he'd sold his last remaining carriage that morning, right down to his prized greys, Lawrence had rented this hack to keep up appearances. Mr. York was one of the most powerful MPs in the House of Commons. Mrs. York was bosom friends with a patroness of Almack's. They had wealth, status, everything they could ever want, except a title. After the wedding, the York's daughter would be a duchess, their grandson a future duke. To them, such a jaw-dropping coup would be more than worth any dowry required. For him, it meant a new leaf. The Earl of Sotheby was seeking partners for an investment opportunity with very attractive interest rates, if Lawrence came up with his portion before the Earl quit London at the end of the season. It was not a flashy wager, like the sort his father had made at his gentlemen's clubs, but the steady interest and future profit would provide a strong foundation for years to come. To Lawrence, marriage to respectable Miss York meant far more than financial stability. His children could be children, without fear of mockery or poverty. It would give his sons and daughters the chance, no, the right to be happy. Everyone deserved as much, including his new bride. Lawrence could not afford to woo Miss York for an entire season, but he could give her a week or two to get to know him before the betrothal. He reached for the framed canvas on the seat opposite. "Once the traffic clears, I'll alight at the last house. I shan't be more than half an hour." But the carriages crowding the Yorks' side of the square did not move. The queue appeared to be idly awaiting passengers. One of the Yorks' neighbours must be hosting a tea. He grimaced. Lawrence hated tea. He would rather drink water from the Thames. "Stop here." He reached for the door. "Find your way to the front of the queue so I know where to find you when I return." The driver nodded and allowed the curtain to fall closed. Despite residing on opposite sides of Grosvenor Square, this was Lawrence's first call at the York residence. The warm red brick and painted white columns of the impeccable terrace house were bright and clean. Every window glistened in the sunlight, reflecting the azure spring sky or the trim green grass in the square. Jaw clenched, he strode down the pavement toward their front walk as elegantly as one could with a heavy brown paper-wrapped framed painting clutched beneath one's arm. Lawrence could have brought his last remaining footman along to carry the painting, but he hoped a show of personal effort would add an extra touch of romance to his unusual gift. It was not what he would have picked, but the important thing was giving his future betrothed something she liked. The finality of marriage prickled his skin with equal parts nervousness and excitement. A fortnight from now, when the contract was signed, he and Miss York would be saddled with each other. His palms felt clammy. Was it foolish to hope their union might be a pleasant one? He drew himself taller. As with all duties, one did as one must. The door was answered as soon as he touched the knocker. Lawrence presented his card at once. "Your Grace," said the butler, "do come in. Shall I ring for someone to take your package?" "I'll deliver it." Lawrence stepped over the threshold to wait for his hosts. He and Mr. York had met in the House of Commons and enjoyed spirited debates for most of a decade. Last year, after the premature death of Lawrence's father, he had moved from the House of Commons to the House of Lords. A partnership with Mr. York would ensure vital allies across the two houses. All he had to do was remain sparklingly unobjectionable until the banns were read. Once Miss York married him, her dowry would save the dukedom and secure a better future for his family and his tenants. The plan had to work. It was Lawrence's only shot. Mrs. York bounded up to him, her hands clasped to her chest as if physically restraining a squeal of excitement. "Your Grace! Such a pleasure, I do say!" The unmistakable sound of female voices trickled from an open door halfway down the corridor straight ahead. Lawrence's skin went cold. This was supposed to be a private meeting. He hated surprises and was inept at impromptu conversations. He excelled in Parliament because he prepared his speeches in advance, just as he had done for today's visit with Miss York and her parents. Interacting with an unexpected crowd would ensure he made a hash out of his well-rehearsed lines. He stepped no farther. "Did I mistake the date?" he inquired carefully. No, right on time as always." Mr. York strode up to join his wife. You're a man who cleaves to duty, a fine trait, I dare say. Very little in common with your father. Thank you. I should hope I'm nothing like him. Quite right, quite right. Your parliamentary speeches could rival Fox and Pitt. Your father, on the other hand, rarely left his club or his cups. Indeed, there are many who say—" Mr. York coughed and gave Lawrence a jovial clap on the shoulder. "'Tis no time for gossip, is it, my boy?" Lawrence affected an affable smile. At least, he hoped that was what his face was doing. He was conscious every day that the Gosling name teetered on the edge of respectability. Mr. York's unfinished intimation had been clear. There were still those who said Faircliff Dukes were a blight on society. Duke or not, nothing was certain until the contract was signed. "It is our honour, Your Grace," Mrs. York gushed as she fluttered her hands in excitement and impatience. "Is that the special gift for Philippa? Come, you must present it to her at once." "I admit I can't fathom what beauty she sees in that painting," Mr. York murmured. Lawrence held the frame a little harder. Dancing hobgoblins were an unusual subject. He did not understand why anyone would want it. What if, upon second inspection, the young lady realised her error in having expressed admiration for such questionable art, and laughed in his face when he presented it as a gift? Being able to give an item he already possessed had seemed like serendipity. Now he feared the omen might not be positive. His veins hummed with panic. "It sounds as though Miss York is entertaining guests." He gripped the frame. "I should return when I'm not interrupting." "Stuff and nonsense!" Mrs. York looped her hand about the crook of Lawrence's elbow and all but dragged him down the corridor. "It's just a few of her blue-stocking friends. I'm certain they'll all find it amusing to see what you've brought Philippa." Yes, exactly what he was afraid of. But there was no backing out now. His father's word wasn't worth the breath it floated on, but Lawrence had kept every vow for 32 years. Miss York liked the painting. He'd promised to give it to her. On this day, at this time. Nowhere to go but forward. Besides, a few blue stockings was hardly a lion's den. Was it? "Philippa, my dear, look who's arrived!" Mrs. York sang out as they entered a grand parlour. The room was enormous, with seats for over 24 guests, and every chair was full. Lawrence could feel the weight of too many gazes landing on him at once. Half of them he did not recognise. Perhaps those were the blue-stockings. But the other half were familiar faces from polite society. He swallowed hard. He didn't merely need to impress Miss York and her parents. He needed to charm an entire room. If only influencing a parlour full of women were as easy as debating customs and excise reform at Westminster with a few hundred of his peers. Quoting the latest committee findings was unlikely to gain him any points here. He wouldn't acknowledge any of them, Lawrence decided. The situation was too fraught, and the chance for error too high. Missteps, like smiling at or snubbing the wrong young lady. He would place all of his attention on Miss York. That could be interpreted as romantic, could it not? Here he was with a courting gift, a knight bearing a tapestry of dancing demons for his fair maiden. Miss York, for her part, was enshrouded in her usual yards of voluminous lace. Only her pink cheeks and dimpled hands protruded from the delicate froth, lending her the appearance of a life-sized doll. Her eternally blank expression made the resemblance uncanny. "Miss York," Lawrence began, then paused. He could not kiss her hand with the painting in his arms, and setting it on the ground risked damage. Bowing would be just as unwieldy. He would have to skip the niceties and rush straight to the romance. "I've brought you a humble token of my admiration."
"Oh!"
gasped one of her friends.
"What could it be?"
A painting my mother informed him I might enjoy. Miss York gestured toward a blank spot on the wall. She intends to put it there. So, she was not impressed with his courtship gift. Lawrence forced himself to smile anyway. Miss York didn't smile back. The rest of the room was alive with whispers. Is it a love match? Why else would he wed beneath him? My father is a marquis. What? Did you think he was bringing the gift to you? Do you think she loves him? Who can ever tell what she's thinking? I cannot wait to see the artwork he brought her. The back of Lawrence's neck flushed with heat. Yes, Miss York was marrying him for his title. Yes, he needed her dowry. But that didn't have to be all they shared. Even a marriage of convenience could work with a modicum of effort. But first, he had to get rid of this bloody painting. Could someone ring for a pair of shears? He asked politely. Here! Mrs. York trilled. 2 wigged footmen, identical in height and elegant livery, glided into the room and relieved Lawrence of the canvas. Now was his chance to kiss Miss York's hand. Before he could do so, a maid handed her a sharp pair of metal shears. Miss York rose to her feet in a rustle of lace. A wave of whispers once again rushed through the parlour. Lawrence risked a subtle glance over his shoulder. Every gaze was transfixed on Miss York. Except for one. One woman's dark brown eyes arrested him. She did not seem curious about the gift. Her disconcertingly intense expression was shrewd, as if she could see through the brown paper package, see through his meticulously tailored layers of fashionable apparel, see through him to the nervousness and desperation beneath. But she did not look away. Her gaze only sharpened, as if she had stripped him bare and still wanted more. His throat grew dry. He tried to swallow. An odd prickling sensation travelled up his spine as though the tips of her fingers had brushed against his skin. He quickly turned back to Miss York. The delivery of the gift had stretched on long enough. If she didn't cut through the paper soon, Lawrence would rip it apart with his bare hands, make his bow and escape to his waiting carriage before he was forced to follow this performance with tea and small talk. "If you'd be so kind," he murmured. Miss York sliced through the brown paper as though she had little interest in safekeeping the art beneath. The paper fell away. The painting was exposed. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Whether at the romance of the gesture, or because the subject featured a family of mischievous sprites, Lawrence could not say. "Thank you," Miss York said. "You are most kind." Was she smitten? Bored? She did not appear to be upset or in any danger of swooning. He gave a gift. She received the gift. Fin. The back of his neck heated anew. He appreciated her extreme lack of drama, Lawrence told himself. After her dowry, her predictability was his favourite trait. A woman like Miss York would never muddy the Faircliff title with scandal. She was exactly what he needed. No scrapes, no surprises. Mrs. York burst into loud applause. Huzzah! Everyone in the room followed suit. Everyone, that was, except Miss York, and the oddly intense young woman with the mocking half-smile. Her gaze continued to track him, as though she could hear each over-loud heartbeat and sense each shallow breath from across the room. He did not like the sensation at all. Despite the room full of strangers, her regard felt strangely intimate and far too perceptive. "As soon as the painting is hung," Mrs. York chirped, "we shall all remove to the dining room for a nice, leisurely tea." Good God, anything but that. Besides his distaste for tea, Lawrence could not court anyone properly while dodging the unsettling gaze of the woman with the pretty brown eyes. Even now he was thinking of her instead of concentrating on Miss York. It would not do. Once the painting was hung, Lawrence would bolt out the door and into the sanctity of his carriage. His driver had better be ready to fly. Chapter 3. Chloe folded her hands in her lap and did her best not to glare a hole right through the handsome, haughty Duke of Faircliff. All of this would have been much easier if Faircliff would simply return the painting. But addressing his arrogance directly did not work. Chloe and her siblings had pleaded for months in countless letters sent to his home and dozens of humiliating attempts in person. His infuriating loftiness was far too superior to see reason, or commoners like the Winchester siblings. His frigid blue gaze looked right at Chloe and slid away just as quickly, having glimpsed nothing to attract his interest. How many times had she and Faircliff crossed paths? Hyde Park, Berkeley Square, Westminster. Every disdainful glance in her direction was as indifferent as the last. She lifted her chin. Bean had taught her that. To the right person she would be visible and memorable. Faircliff was clearly the wrong person. Not that she wanted him to notice her, Chloe reminded herself. The continued success of Jane Brown hinged on her uncanny ability to be wholly unremarkable under any circumstances. She gripped the soft muslin of her skirt. Tommy might be an unparalleled genius with disguises, but Chloe needn't do anything at all to blend in and be forgettable. She possessed one of those faces that was at once familiar yet too ordinary to pick out from a crowd. She was neither tall nor short, ugly nor pretty. Nothing about her stood out. Her skin wasn't palest alabaster like Philippa York's, or golden bronze like her brother Graham's. She was not thin and willowy like Tommy, or pleasingly plump like Elizabeth. Her limp brown hair wasn't spun flax like Marjorie's, or blessed with glossy black curls like Jacob's. Chloe was neutral and dull, with nary even a freckle to add a spot of interest. She was just there, like a dust mote in a shaft of light. Her perpetual insignificance had helped her through scrape after scrape. Chloe would never admit how much she wished, just once, to see a flicker of recognition reflected back at her. Not that her expectations of Faircliff were high. What type of conceited, cold-hearted knave blithely gave away a painting he did not own as a courtship gift? A villain like that could not be trusted or reasoned with. He'd had his chance to deal honourably. Chloe wouldn't beg him for the painting even if she could. At this point, the duplicitous, arrogant blackguard deserved to have it whisked out of his hands. She forced her tense fingers to unclench and folded them in her lap. Soon. "Thank you ever so much for your charming gift," Mrs. York cooed loud enough for the entire party to hear, and likely the neighbours as well. "Philippa is overjoyed." Philippa did not appear to be overjoyed, or even middling-level joyful. She bore the same "I am here because I must be" expression she wore at every social function, save the brief occasions when her mother left her side and the reading circle could actually talk about books. Chloe imagined her far more interested in the Duke's famed library than in the man himself. Not that Faircliff seemed particularly infatuated. A man in love would have dreamed up a gift better suited to his bride. "My gratitude," Philippa murmured. The Duke looked self-congratulatory. "My pleasure." Chloe glared at him on behalf of women everywhere who longed for more than token gestures of false affection. But Faircliff's kind didn't waste time on matters of the heart. Lords and ladies, or those who aspired to become them, selected their unions with cold practicality. Their minds were muddied not with emotion, but with visions of titles and dowries and estates and social connections. Chloe was delighted not to belong to a world like that. Mrs. York clapped her hands together. "And now, a celebratory tea!" The Duke's face displayed a comical look of alarm. "I don't think—" "You must join us." Mrs. York's hands flapped like a frightened bird's. "The ladies were about to have oatcakes and cucumber sandwiches." "We were about to discuss epistolary structure in 18th century French novels," Philippa murmured. "I never meant to interrupt," Fairclough said with haste. "I mustn't stay. And in fact—" "Nonsense! Come, all of you!" Mrs. York waved her arms about the room, driving her guests into the dining room like a shepherd herding sheep. Chloe and Fairclough were both caught in the flow. Once they passed through the doorway, however, Chloe stepped to one side. She could not take a seat at the table or she would be stuck there for the next hour. While everyone else was occupied, this was her chance to liberate her beloved Puck. But first, she needed an excuse to disappear. An adorable, furry reason. She released Tiglet from the large wicker basket. The calico kitten darted between boots and beneath petticoats with a formidable "Rawr!" Mrs. York gave a dramatic shriek in response. Tiglet scaled several curtains in search of an open window before darting out of the dining room and flying off down the corridor as though his tail were afire. Chloe gasped as if shocked that her homing kitten was attempting to dash home. "How embarrassing! I'll run and find the naughty little scamp at once. Please don't wait for me." Philippa glanced up from her place at the table. "I could help." "Sit down," her mother hissed. "The Duke is here." Philippa sighed. "We could at least ring for a maid or footman." "It's really no trouble," Chloe assured her. "Please serve the tea." With a meaningful glance to Mrs. York, Chloe made several unsubtle tilts of her head toward the Duke of Fairclough, who was tarrying noticeably, as if reluctant to take his place at the table. "Oh," Mrs. York said loudly, "you're absolutely right. Go on, dear. Take your time. Over here, Your Grace. Come and sit by Philippa. We've saved you the best seat." "Have you met the others?" Philippa gestured at each young lady as she took a chair at the table. "To my left is—" Chloe slipped from the room at the sound of Mrs. York chastising her daughter for performing introductions out of the order of precedence. Chloe could be gone an hour before anyone would notice. She wouldn't need but 5 minutes. With her basket hanging from her arm, she ducked into the parlour and closed the door behind her. A broken hairpin in the keyhole would not only prevent anyone from entering behind her, but would also make it obvious a crime was underway. She would simply work fast. There was no sense looking for the kitten. Strands of calico fur and unfortunate paw prints on a velvet curtain indicated Tiglet had already found an open window and was well on his way home. Chloe hurried to lift her family painting from the wall and carried it behind a chinoiserie folding screen in the corner. Cutting the canvas free was not an option. The replacement must look identical to the original, and besides, she would never damage an object that meant this much. Quickly, she lay the frame face down and removed her tools from the basket. Marjorie had drilled Chloe on mounting and unmounting canvases until her fingers were calloused and she could perform the manoeuvre in her sleep. Up came the grips, off came the backing, out came Puck and family. She rolled it into a scroll the size of her forearm and tucked it into the basket before stretching the forgery over the wooden frame. This was the tricky part. There was no way to attach the painting without hammering the grips in place. She must do so in silence. If she placed only one grip on each side and lined each one perfectly with the holes it had come from, there! She hurriedly returned it to the wall. As long as it stayed there, no one would notice the imperfect craftsmanship. And if one day someone did notice, well, that was none of Chloe's concern. Fairclough would be the one who had to explain the shoddy frame. She did not feel sorry for him at all. This was not his painting to give away. For that alone she could never forgive him. She ran to open the parlour door before anyone noticed it had been shut, and strode past the dining room to the front door without taking her leave from the guests. By now, Fairclough and Philippa were exchanging romantic words, with all of the other ladies hanging on every utterance. Would anyone realise she had failed to return? Doubtful. If anything, the ladies would assume Jane Brown had slunk off in mortification. Her throat prickled. She would never know what the other ladies thought of the current novel, but Chloe didn't need reading circles. She was a Winchester. They had each other, which was more than enough. Keeping her face down, she headed along the front walk toward the first carriage in the queue. Only when she glimpsed red curtains and a pair of leather gloves on the box did she lift her head toward the driver's perch. It was empty. Her lungs caught. Where was Graham? Distant shouts reached her ears and her tight muscles relaxed. Something unexpected must have occurred, and her siblings' planned distraction was in progress. This was her cue to flee. Chloe pushed the basket onto the perch, unhooked the carriage from its post, and leapt onto the coachman's seat. Female drivers weren't unheard of, but all the same, she was glad she never went outside without garbing herself in the plainest, dullest, dowdiest clothing in her wardrobe. No one who glanced her way would bother looking for long. She set the horses on a swift path out of Mayfair. Only when Grosvenor Square was no longer visible behind her did she allow herself a small smile of victory. Their cherished family portrait was coming home. Once she walked in that door with their painting held high. "Did we escape?" came a low, velvet voice from within the carriage. Chloe's skin went cold. Who was that? Graham wouldn't be hiding in the back of the carriage. A stranger was in the coach. She twisted about and wrenched the privacy curtain to one side. A handsome face with soft brown hair and sculpted cheekbones stared back at her, glacial blue eyes wide with surprise. "Fairclough?" she blurted in disbelief. You," he spluttered when he found his voice. "What the devil are you doing driving my carriage?"